The morning of November 22nd, 1963, started just like any other Friday in New Orleans. The thick, damp air of Louisiana hung heavy over the city, carrying the familiar smells of the Mississippi River, strong coffee, and the faint sweet scent of baignets drifting from the cafes in the French Quarter. But this day would turn out to be one of the most important moments in all of American history. And for one man sitting calmly in a federal courtroom in New Orleans, it would be the final result of a personal grudge he had been nursing for many years. Carlos Marcello sat at the defense table inside the United States District Court. His small body, just 5'3" tall, was almost swallowed up by all the activity happening around him. His dark eyes, with their heavy lids, showed absolutely nothing of the storm that was surely raging inside him. The government had spent years chasing him. They had literally kidnapped him from American land and dropped him off in a jungle in Central America. They had used all the power of the entire United States Justice Department against him. Right now, the jury was deciding his future, thinking about the charges that said he had planned to cheat the federal government. Hundreds of miles away to the west, in Dallas, Texas, a line of cars carrying President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was slowly driving through Dealey Plaza. The young and popular president, whose brother had made it his own personal goal to destroy Carlos Marcello, was waving at the happy crowds at 12:30 p.m. Central Time. Gunshots ring out. Within 1 hour, John F. Kennedy would be dead that same afternoon. The jury in New Orleans came back with its decision. Not guilty. 2 events, 1 single day. A coincidence that would trouble American history forever. When word of the president's murder reached the New Orleans courtroom, Carlos Marcello's face stayed completely emotionless. The man they called the Little Man, the godfather of the American South. The tomato salesman who controlled a criminal empire worth millions, maybe even tens of millions of dollars every year, walked out of that courthouse a free man. And the brother who had given him so much trouble, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, was now stripped of his power, his protector, and his personal war against the mob. To understand how these 2 separate events came together on that fateful November day, we have to travel back in time, all the way back to the dusty streets of a port city in Tunisia, to a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That ship was carrying a baby who would one day grow up to become the most powerful crime boss in the American South. This is the story of Carlos Marcello. Before we jump deep into one of the most unbelievable mob stories ever told, drop a comment down below and tell me where you are watching from right now. What time is it where you live? Are you listening before you go to sleep, during a late-night drive, or while you are working? I really enjoy reading your comments, and if you haven't done it yet, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss another story. We post new videos every single day. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. Back to a small ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean in 1910. It was carrying a baby who would one day become the most powerful crime boss in the American South. The year was 1910, and the ancient city of Tunis was soaking up the Mediterranean sun. French colonial rule had turned this North African city into a busy meeting place. Arab, French, and Italian cultures all mixed together in the skinny streets of the Medina and the wide boulevards of the European part of town. Among all the different groups of people who called this place home, there was a large community of Sicilian immigrants. These were men and women who had run away from the terrible poverty and constant violence of their homeland, hoping for a better life on the shores of Africa. In a simple home in the Italian neighborhood on February 6, 1910, a woman named Luigia Minor gave birth to her very first child. They named him Calogero, after a beloved Sicilian saint named San Calogero, who was known as the protector of the poor and the guardian of harvests. The baby's father, Giuseppe Minor, was a laborer who had come to Tunisia searching for work. He was following the well-known path taken by countless other Sicilians before him. But Giuseppe Minor was not happy to just stay in Tunisia. Across the Atlantic Ocean, another land was calling to him. America, the Golden Door, the place where even the poorest man could start over and make something of himself. The stories that made their way back to the Sicilian communities in Tunisia told of endless chances, of fortunes waiting to be made, of a new life free from the old-fashioned class system and the crushing poverty of the old world. In 1909, Giuseppe made up his mind. He would go ahead to America by himself, find work, get himself settled, and then send for his pregnant wife and whatever child she would give birth to. He got on a ship that was going to New Orleans, a city that had been welcoming Sicilian immigrants since the 1880s. It was a place where you could hear Italian spoken on the streets just as easily as English or French. It was a place where a man with strong arms and a willingness to work hard could find a way to support himself. Giuseppe found work on a sugar plantation in the low, swampy lands of Louisiana. It was back-breaking labor under the cruel Gulf Coast sun, but it was honest work, and it paid money, slowly. He saved up enough to bring his family across the ocean. In October 1910, just 8 months after baby Calogero was born, Luigia got on a ship with her little son and made the long trip to America. The ship carried them across the Mediterranean Sea, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and out into the huge Atlantic Ocean for weeks. They dealt with the crowded and uncomfortable conditions in steerage class, the seasickness, and the uncertainty of where they were going. When they finally caught a glimpse of the low, swampy shores of Louisiana, they might have wondered what kind of future was waiting for them in this strange new land. They settled down in Jefferson Parish, which is just outside of New Orleans. They lived in what one description called a falling-apart plantation house near the town of Harahan. It was nothing like the fancy Louisiana mansions you see in movies. It was a run-down, broken structure that showed just how poor the family really was. But it was a place to start in America, and that was enough. A short time after they arrived, the Minor family made a decision that would have huge effects on their son's future. Giuseppe's supervisor on the sugar plantation was also named Minor. This coincidence was causing confusion at work. To avoid this problem, the family decided to use a new last name, Marcello. Giuseppe became Joseph, Luigia became Louise, and little Calogero got the Spanish-sounding name that would one day make the political and criminal leaders of Louisiana tremble with fear. Carlos Marcello was not even 2 years old when he arrived in America, and he would grow up speaking the special mix of languages spoken in New Orleans as his first language. It was a blend of Italian, French, English, and the unique Creole rhythms of the Gulf Coast. In every way that mattered, he was an American. But there was one important difference between Carlos and the 8 brothers and sisters who would come after him. They were all born on American soil, so they were automatically citizens just by being born here. Carlos, who was born in French-ruled Tunisia, was not a citizen, whether this was done on purpose or just by accident. Nobody can really say for sure, but this small detail would cause him huge problems for the rest of his entire life. Joseph Marcello was a man with big dreams. Within just a few years of arriving, he had saved up enough money to leave the sugar plantation and buy a small vegetable farm in Algiers. Algiers was a working-class neighborhood on the west bank of the Mississippi River, across from downtown New Orleans, This is where the Marcello family decided to put down roots and stay. And this is where Carlos would spend his childhood and teenage years. The farm was small and simple, but it was theirs. Joseph grew vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, the familiar produce from his Sicilian homeland. He sold them at the big farmers' markets in the French Quarter. From a very young age, Carlos would go with his father on these trips. He learned how to handle a horse and wagon, how to bargain with customers, and how to find his way through the crowded streets of New Orleans' oldest and most colorful neighborhood. The French Quarter during the 1920s was like a whole different world. The beautiful Creole townhouses with their fancy iron balconies stood right next to crowded apartment buildings packed with Italian immigrants. There were so many Sicilians living in the neighborhood that people who lived there called it Little Palermo, after the capital city of Sicily. Here, in the narrow streets and dark, hidden alleys, the old traditions of Sicily lived on. This included the ancient codes and rules of the Mafia. New Orleans had been home to organized crime since the 1870s, when the Matronga brothers, Charles and Antonio, started one of the earliest American Mafia families ever recorded. The Matrongas had survived gang wars, police investigations, and even the biggest mass lynching in American history. That happened in 1891, when an angry mob stormed the old parish, prisoned and murdered 11 Italian men who were accused of killing the city's police chief. Charles Matronga had hidden during the killing and later came out to rebuild his power. He eventually forced his rival groups to leave the city. By the time young Carlos Marcello was walking around and exploring the French Quarter, the local mafia had been run by several different bosses. It was now controlled by Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Corallo. He was a Sicilian immigrant who had turned Matronga's old gang into a modern, professional criminal organization. Silver Dollar Sam got his nickname because he liked to show off silver dollars to his friends and business partners. It was a small sign of vanity that hid his truly cruel nature. Carlos Marcello was a very observant child, and the French Quarter was an excellent place to learn. He watched the well-dressed men who ran the gambling houses and the houses of prostitution. He noticed how they commanded respect from the shop owners and fear from their rivals. He learned how important it was to have connections, to do favors for people and have them do favors for you, and about the complicated web of loyalty that held the Sicilian community together. And he soaked in, maybe without even fully understanding it, the Code of Omerta. This was the law of silence that said you could never cooperate with the police, and that all arguments had to be settled within the family. When Carlos was 14 years old, he dropped out of school. The world of books and learning held no interest for him at all. His education was going to be a completely different kind. He spent all his time helping his father with the vegetable business. He drove the wagon full of vegetables through the pre-dawn darkness to the markets in the French Quarter. But more and more, his attention started to wander toward the men who worked on the edges of normal, law-abiding society, the gamblers, the bootleggers, the hustlers who made their living in the shadows. Carlos Marcello was 18 years old in 1928. He had grown into a short, powerfully built young man with dark, hooded eyes that seemed to notice everything. That year, he made a very important decision. He left his father's farm and moved into a $2-a-week room in the French Quarter. The vegetable business would have to go on without him. Carlos had chosen a different road to follow. The late 1920s were the peak of Prohibition, and New Orleans, just like every other major American city, was flooded with illegal alcohol. The city was close to the Gulf of Mexico, which made it a perfect place for rum to be smuggled in from Cuba and the Caribbean. Bootleggers were becoming millionaires overnight, and the chances for a young man who was willing to take risks seemed to have no limits. Carlos started out small. He and a few friends pulled off small robberies in the little towns around New Orleans. They targeted grocery stores and other easy places to rob. He was learning his new profession, testing himself, and finding out what he was truly capable of doing. The answer, it turned out, was quite a lot. In 1929, Carlos planned his most daring crime yet. It was a bank robbery in Algiers, his own neighborhood. The job was bold, but it was not very well thought out. When the police started asking questions, Carlos got his father Joseph to hide the stolen money on the family farm. But then something happened that would leave a deep and lasting scar on Carlos's mind. His younger brother Peter went to the police and told them on him. Carlos and his father were both arrested. The situation looked very bad. Bank robbery was a serious crime, and Carlos was facing many years in prison. But then, in a stroke of good luck that would become a common pattern in his life, the bank decided not to press charges once the money was given back. Carlos walked out of jail a free man, but he never forgot what his brother had done. He had learned a very clear lesson. Trust absolutely no one completely, not even the members of your own family. 5 months later, Carlos's luck finally ran out. He came up with a plan to rob a grocery store, but instead of doing the crime himself, he hired 2 teenagers, ages 13 and 16, to actually carry out the robbery. It was a clever idea in theory. If the boys got caught, they were too young to face really serious punishment, and Carlos could just say he didn't know anything about it. But the whole plan fell apart when the young robbers were caught, and right away told the police that Carlos was the one who had planned the whole thing. The local newspapers had a great time writing about the story. They compared Carlos to Fagin, the criminal in Charles Dickens's book Oliver Twist, who used young children to do his stealing for him. The comparison was very fitting. Here was a 19-year-old man using boys even younger than himself to do his dirty work. The court was not amused at all. Carlos was found guilty of assault and robbery. He was sentenced to serve 9 to 14 years at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in West Feliciana Parish. The Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly called Angola after the old plantation where it was built, was one of the most brutal prisons in all of America. It was named after the African country from which many of the enslaved workers on the plantation had originally come. Angola was a huge collection of fields and dormitories where the prisoners worked in conditions that were hardly any better than slavery. Men would go into Angola and come out completely broken, if they came out at all. But Carlos Marcello was not like the other prisoners. He had a special quality that would help him greatly throughout his whole life: the ability to make himself useful to people who had power. Instead of suffering in the brutal work gangs out in the fields, Carlos managed to get himself a job as the warden's yard boy. It was an easy assignment that kept him close to where the power was. According to some stories, Carlos found out that the warden was having a secret affair with the prison cook. He used this knowledge to make sure he got treated better than the other prisoners. After serving about 4 or 5 years of his sentence, Carlos received a full pardon from Governor O.K. Allen. Governor Allen was a political ally of the famous Louisiana politician Huey P. Long, the Kingfish, as Long was called, controlled Louisiana politics completely. His political machine had the power to get a young criminal with good connections out of Angola. It was Carlos's first lesson in how valuable it is to have connections in politics. It was a lesson he would never, ever forget. Carlos Marcello walked out of the gates of Angola in 1935. He was 25 years old, Prison had made him tougher, but it had not broken him. If anything, he had used his time inside to make new connections and to improve his understanding of how power really works in the world. He had walked into Angola as a small-time crook. He would walk out as something much more dangerous, fresh out of prison. Carlos Marcello did not waste any time getting back to business. But he was smarter now, and he thought more carefully about things. He understood that the secret to lasting success was not just committing crimes. It was about building a legal business that would protect him from people looking too closely at him. At the same time, this legal business would bring in the cash and the connections he needed to make his illegal operations bigger. In 1935, Carlos scraped together a $500 down payment and bought a run-down bar in Gretna, which is the main town in Jefferson Parish. He named the place the Brown Bomber, after the heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis. The bar served almost only black customers on the surface. It was just another neighborhood bar where people went to drink. But underneath the surface, it was something completely different. The Brown Bomber offered its customers more than just drinks. Carlos and his brothers, Peter had apparently been forgiven for telling on him earlier, provided their customers with women and marijuana. The business was making good money, and most importantly, it was protected. Carlos was learning that the really big money in crime came not from taking big risks, but from buying insurance. That insurance came in the form of paying off police officers and politicians so they would look the other way. At the same time, Carlos was making connections within the New Orleans Mafia leadership. He had come to the attention of Frank Todaro, who was a captain in the organization led by Silver Dollar Sam Corallo. Todaro saw potential in this ambitious young man and took him under his wing. He sponsored Carlos to be officially brought into the honored society. By the late 1930s, Carlos Marcello had become a made man in the New Orleans Mafia. He was a full member, bound by a blood oath to the organization. This meant he was entitled to its protection and a share of its profits. But his most important connection to the Todaro family would happen through a completely different kind of bond. Carlos's sister, Mary, had become best friends with Jacqueline Todaro, Frank's daughter, when Mary got married. Jacqueline was a bridesmaid, and Carlos was the best man. At the wedding, Carlos met Jacqueline for the first time and was immediately attracted to her. She was beautiful, she had powerful connections, and she was everything Carlos could ever want in a wife. On September 6, 1938, Carlos Marcello married Jacqueline Todaro at a ceremony in New Orleans. The marriage made his position in the Mafia leadership even stronger. His new father-in-law was one of the most powerful men in the organization, and his new wife gave him a way into the highest circles of the New Orleans underworld. The newly married couple set up their home in a small apartment above Carlos's liquor store in Algiers. Jacqueline ran the store, while Carlos focused all his energy on making his criminal businesses bigger. The young couple would eventually have 4 children together: Louise, Joseph, Florence, and another Jacqueline, named after her mother. Even though his profession was brutal, Carlos would turn out to be a devoted family man. He kept his home life stable and normal, even while he was building an empire based on corruption, violence, and illegal activities. In March 1938, Carlos Marcello made a serious mistake. He sold 23 pounds of marijuana to a man who turned out to be an undercover federal agent. According to newspaper stories, it was the biggest marijuana arrest in New Orleans history. Carlos was arrested, found guilty, and sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison, plus an enormous fine of $76,830 for most men. This would have been a terrible, crushing blow. But Carlos Marcello was not like most men. Thanks to a deal he made with the political machine run by the Long family, Huey had been assassinated in 1935. But his brothers and allies still ran Louisiana. Carlos served less than 10 months of his sentence. And as for the huge fine, he paid only $400. He claimed he was a poor man who could not afford to pay any more. The message was very clear. Carlos Marcello had protection at the very highest levels of the Louisiana government. He was now much more than just another gangster. He was a man with connections that reached all the way into the governor's mansion itself. It was during this time that Carlos made the connection that would change him from a local gangster into a major player in national organized crime. While Carlos was dealing with his own problems over marijuana, a crisis was developing in New York City that would have huge effects all the way down in Louisiana. Fiorello LaGuardia, the reform-minded mayor of New York, had declared war on the slot machines that were in bars, restaurants, and social clubs all over the city. These one-armed bandits were controlled by Frank Costello. Costello was a mobster from New York. Known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, he had built a slot machine empire that was making millions of dollars every year, and LaGuardia was determined to destroy it. The mayor personally helped smash the machines that were taken. He happily broke them with a sledgehammer, while photographers took pictures of his war against vice. It was great for show, but for Costello, it was a complete disaster. He needed to move his machines somewhere else, and he needed to do it fast. Costello's rescue came from a very unlikely source. Huey P. Long, the Kingfish of Louisiana, had met Costello in circumstances that people still argue about today. Some people say Costello helped Long in a bar fight at the Sands Point Bath and Country Club on Long Island. The two men became friends and started a relationship that was good for both of them. Long invited Costello to bring his slot machines to Louisiana. There, they would operate under the protection of the Long political machine. In exchange, Costello would give them a share of the profits. The agreement said that Costello would pay $30,000 every year for each machine to support charities in Louisiana. At least, that is what Costello later said when he testified about it. In reality, the money went to Long's political organization. It helped keep the gears turning in the most corrupt state government in America. When Huey Long was assassinated on September 8, 1935, the slot machine deal did not die with him. His brother Earl Long and the political machine he had built continued to protect the operation. Frank Costello sent his trusted lieutenant, Philip Dandy Phil Costello, to New Orleans to take care of the Louisiana operations. They started a company called the Bayou Novelty Company to act as a legal front, and they began flooding Louisiana with slot machines. But Costello and Costello needed local partners. They needed men who knew the area, who already had relationships with police officers and politicians, and who could handle any problems that came up. They needed someone like Carlos Marcello. Exactly how Carlos started working with the Costello organization is something we do not know for sure anymore. But by the early 1940s, he had become an essential part of the operation. He put slot machines all throughout Jefferson Parish. He used his political connections to make sure that law enforcement officers just looked the other way. His company, the Jefferson Music Company, was a front for putting jukeboxes and pinball machines in businesses. This gave him legal business interests that could explain why he was becoming so wealthy. The slot machines were extremely profitable, with hundreds of machines running all over Louisiana, each one taking in coins all day and night. The money piled up very quickly, and Carlos, as the most important local partner, received a generous share of it, but Carlos Marcello was not happy just staying a middleman. He was building his own base of power. He was creating relationships that would be very useful to him in the years ahead. He cultivated relationships with politicians, paying off sheriffs, judges, and city council members. He invested in legal businesses, tomato farms, real estate, shrimp boats, and he waited for his chance to move up. His partnership with Costello also brought Carlos into contact with Meyer Lansky. Lansky was the financial genius of organized crime. He had been working with Costello since the bootlegging days of Prohibition. Lansky was building a network of casinos all over the country, and also in Cuba. Carlos became part of this network. He got a share of the Beverly Country Club. This was a fancy gambling place in suburban Metairie that served the rich and important gamblers of New Orleans. By the middle of the 1940s, Carlos Marcello had changed himself from a small-time criminal into a sophisticated businessman. He had interests in gambling, real estate, and many different legal businesses. Politicians and businessmen all over Louisiana knew who he was. He was now ready to make the next big jump in his criminal career. In 1947, everything changed. Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Corallo, who had been the leader of the New Orleans Mafia for more than 10 years, was facing deportation. The federal government was starting to understand the threat that organized crime posed. They had begun targeting mobsters who had been born in other countries to have them removed from the United States. Corallo, like Carlos, had been born overseas and had never become an American citizen. Now, this weakness would cost him everything. On April 30th, 1947, Corallo was deported to Sicily. This left a huge empty space at the top of the New Orleans crime family. The question of who would take over had to be answered quickly. They had to decide before rival groups could try to take control, or before crime families from other cities could move in on their territory. The decision was made by the National Mafia Commission. This was the group that had been created by Charles Lucky Luciano in 1931 to help all the different crime families work together and to settle arguments between them. Frank Costello was one of the most powerful men on the commission. He had a lot of influence over who would be chosen. And Costello knew exactly who he wanted, his trusted local partner, Carlos Marcello. At 37 years old, Carlos Marcello was approved by the commission to become the new boss of the New Orleans crime family. He was now the godfather, the highest authority over organized crime in Louisiana. And more, his power spread throughout the whole Gulf Coast region. The change in leadership was smooth. Corallo himself, from his exile in Sicily, reportedly approved of Marcello taking over for him. He might have thought of it as a temporary arrangement until he could come back to America. But Corallo would never get his power back. Carlos Marcello had absolutely no plans to give up his new position. He immediately started making his control stronger. He used a combination of being generous and being cruel, which would become his special style. Marcello understood that the secret to keeping power for a long time was to make sure everyone made money. As long as the soldiers and captains under his command were earning money, they would stay loyal to him. He made the family's gambling operations bigger. He took control of illegal casinos and betting operations all over Louisiana. He forced his way into the labor unions that controlled the docks in New Orleans. He invested in bars, restaurants, and other legal businesses that could be used to hide and clean his illegal money. Most importantly, he made his relationships with Louisiana's political leaders even stronger. Governors, state legislators, judges, sheriffs, police chiefs. They all became part of Marcello's network of corruption. He gave money to their political campaigns. He did them favors. He created a sense of obligation, so that when he needed something from them, they would feel they had to pay him back. Marcello set up his main office at the Town and Country Motel on Airline Highway in Metairie, just outside New Orleans. From this small, simple office in a suburban motel, he would run his empire for the next 30 years. It was an unimpressive location. It fit with the image he had carefully created of himself as just a simple tomato salesman. But how things looked was very deceiving. The man who sat behind that desk controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in all of America. By 1950, Carlos Marcello's criminal empire stretched from the Mississippi Gulf Coast all the way to the Texas border and even further. His influence reached all the way to Dallas. Dallas became, for all practical purposes, an outpost of his New Orleans operation. He worked closely with Santo Trafficante Jr. in Tampa and San Giancana in Chicago. He worked together with other major crime families while still keeping his own independence within his own territory. The size of Marcello's operations was truly shocking. His organization controlled gambling in every form: slot machines, horse racing, betting on sports, card games, and dice games. They ran prostitution rings. They traded in illegal drugs. They controlled the labor unions that ran the New Orleans waterfront. They were involved in forcing people to pay them money, loan sharking, and countless other illegal activities. People who estimated how much money Marcello's organization made every year said it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. At its highest point, his empire was valued at $2 billion. That amount of money would have made him one of the richest men in America. But his fortune was very carefully hidden behind many layers of fake companies, family members, and people who lent their names for his businesses. Marcello's great skill was in how well he understood the connection between crime and politics. In Louisiana, the two could not be separated. One after another, the governors Jimmy Davis, Earl Long, John McKeithen, were all connected to Marcello in different ways. One source claimed that Marcello gave $168,000 to McKeithen over a period of 8 years. In exchange, McKeithen did various favors for him. These favors included help with land deals involving Marcello's huge property called Churchill Farms. Churchill Farms was a perfect example of Marcello's methods. He had bought about 6,000 acres of swampland in Jefferson Parish. He paid around $1 million for what looked like completely worthless land. But then, using his political connections, he arranged for public money to be used to drain the water and improve the land. What had been a swamp turned into valuable commercial land worth an estimated $60 million. On paper, it was completely legal, but in reality, it was totally corrupt. Marcello had a strict rule about keeping his territory independent. No mobster from any other family could come into Louisiana without first asking for his permission. He was very protective of his area, and anyone who broke this rule faced serious consequences. At the same time, he built relationships with crime families all over the country. He went to the National Commission meetings where the major families planned their activities together. When other bosses needed help with their operations in Florida or Las Vegas, Marcello would send them some of his men for a price. According to some stories, he received a share of the money that was secretly taken from Las Vegas casinos. This was payment for the services his organization provided to the National Crime Syndicate. His alliance with Trafficante gave him access to the Cuban casino business that was doing very well under the Batista government. His connections with Giancana linked him to the powerful Chicago mob. But for all his power, Marcello tried to look humble and respectable. He dressed simply and drove ordinary cars that did not stand out. To anyone who asked, he said he was just a tomato salesman and a real estate investor. He put his businesses in the names of his relatives and friends to avoid people looking too closely at him. And he had a strict rule that he never personally committed violence. He had other people to do that for him. On January 25, 1951, Carlos Marcello faced his first serious challenge from the federal government. He was ordered to appear before the Special Committee to investigate organized crime and interstate commerce. It was better known as the Kefauver Committee, named after its chairman, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. The Kefauver Committee was a huge sensation. For the very first time, Americans could watch congressional hearings on television, and millions of people tuned in. The committee traveled all over the country, holding hearings in 14 major cities. They showed the American people the connections between organized crime, corrupt politicians, and legal businesses. The people who testified ranged from local sheriffs to well-known gangsters. They were all called to explain themselves in front of the TV cameras. When the committee came to New Orleans, they ran into a wall of silence and corruption. Local law enforcement officials admitted that they knew about gambling operations, but they did almost nothing to stop them. Sheriff King Clancy of Jefferson Parish said that slot machines were operating openly in his area, even though they were against state law. This was a clear failure to do his sworn duty. And then there was Carlos Marcello. When Marcello sat down in front of the committee, it was obvious that his lawyers had told him exactly what to do. To every important question about what he did, who his friends were, how much money he made, and what criminal businesses he ran, he gave the exact same answer. He used his Fifth Amendment right to not say anything that might get him in trouble. 152 times, Carlos Marcello took the fifth. The committee was frustrated, but they were not completely surprised. Marcello was hardly the first gangster to refuse to answer their questions. But the committee's final report was still very damaging. They described Marcello as one of the worst criminals in the whole country. They said he was a man who had corrupted Louisiana politics and built a criminal empire by paying bribes and threatening people. The Kefauver hearings had an immediate effect on what the public thought. Americans were shocked to learn how far organized crime had spread into their own communities. Candidates who promised to make reforms won elections all over the country. Gambling bosses in Las Vegas quickly tried to make it look like they had nothing to do with the mob. But in Louisiana, nothing changed at all. Carlos Marcello came out of the hearings without any damage. His friends in politics were still in power. His gambling businesses kept doing well. The committee could show people how corrupt things were, but it could not actually take anyone to court. And in Louisiana, the people in charge of taking criminals to court were the same men that Marcello had in his pocket, however. The Kefauver hearings did start one chain of events that would cause Marcello trouble for many years. In February 1953, the Immigration and Naturalization Service issued an order to deport him, Carlos Marcello, who was born in Tunisia and had never become a naturalized American citizen, was officially an undesirable alien. This meant he could be removed from the United States. It was the beginning of a legal fight that would take up much of Marcello's energy for the rest of his life. And it set the stage for his very important and dangerous meeting with the Kennedy family. On March 24, 1959, Carlos Marcello was told to come to Washington to appear in front of another congressional committee. This time, it was the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field. It was chaired by Senator John L. McClellan of Arkansas. The committee was looking into the connections between organized crime and labor unions. They were especially interested in the powerful Teamsters Union, which was led by Jimmy Hoffa. Marcello sat down in the hearing room and got ready to do the same thing he had done for the Kefauver Committee. He planned to use the Fifth Amendment for every question. But this time, there was a new person involved. He was a young, aggressive lawyer who was the committee's main counsel. His name was Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was only 33 years old, but he had already built a reputation as a determined prosecutor. He had a special hatred for organized crime. He had grown up with many advantages. He was the seventh of 9 children born to Joseph P. Kennedy, one of the richest men in America. But having a privileged life had not made him soft. He was driven, intense, and completely sure that he was right. Kennedy had made Jimmy Hoffa his main target. He had spent years investigating corruption in the Teamsters Union. He would eventually send Hoffa to prison, but Hoffa was just one head of the monster. Kennedy understood that the real power behind the corruption in labor unions was the Mafia, and he was determined to destroy it. When Marcello appeared in front of the committee, Kennedy was relentless in asking him questions. He asked about Marcello's criminal record, his business partners, his political connections, and his control over gambling in Louisiana. To every question, Marcello used the Fifth Amendment. Kennedy was clearly disgusted. According to reports, he told Marcello during a break in the hearings, "You're nothing but a bum. You're just a cheap little hood." The insult hurt Carlos deeply. Carlos Marcello was many things. A murderer, someone who corrupted politicians, a drug dealer, a racketeer. But he was not used to being treated with such disrespect. He had built a huge empire. He controlled an entire state. He answered to no one. And now this privileged young Kennedy was calling him a bum. According to many different stories, Marcello left Washington boiling with anger. He had been humiliated on national television by a man half his age. And Bobby Kennedy had made it very clear that he planned to continue his war against organized crime. This confrontation would have results that neither man could have ever imagined. On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. One of his very first actions was to appoint his brother Robert as Attorney General. This was a controversial choice that critics said was just giving a job to a family member. But it gave Bobby Kennedy the power he needed to continue his war against organized crime. Robert Kennedy did not waste any time. He made the Justice Department's organized crime section much bigger. He increased its staff from just a few lawyers to dozens. He pushed for new laws that targeted organized crime, and he made it very clear that Carlos Marcello was near the very top of his list of people to go after. For Marcello, this appointment was a disaster. During the Eisenhower administration, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had refused to admit that organized crime even existed. He famously said that the Mafia was just a myth. This willful ignorance had allowed Marcello and other mob bosses to operate without too much trouble. But Bobby Kennedy had no patience for Hoover's denials. He demanded action, and he got it. Kennedy's secret weapon was Marcello's immigration problem. For almost 10 years, the government had been trying to deport Marcello, but their efforts had been stopped by his clever use of the legal system. Also, no other country would take him. Tunisia would not take him back. Italy would not accept him because he had never been an Italian citizen. In legal terms, he was a man without a country. But Marcello had made a mistake years earlier. He had tried to give himself a safe place to go if he was ever deported. He had gotten a fake Guatemalan birth certificate. A bribed official in Guatemala City had officially stated that Carlos Marcello was actually born in that country. This meant he was a Guatemalan citizen. It was like an insurance policy. It was a backup plan in case the government ever succeeded in deporting him. Bobby Kennedy decided to use Marcello's own plan against him. April 4th, 1961, was a beautiful spring day in New Orleans. Carlos Marcello, as he did every few months, drove to the Immigration and Naturalization Service office in the federal building. He had to check in with them regularly. This was a condition of being free while the government continued trying to deport him. It was a bother, but Marcello had been through this routine many times before. He expected to sign some papers, have a friendly chat with the officials, and then go on his way. But what happened instead was like something from a Cold War spy movie. The moment Marcello walked into the inn's office, immigration agents grabbed him. They put handcuffs on him before he could even say a single word. When he demanded to call his wife or his lawyer, they refused. They rushed him out of the building, pushed him into a waiting car, and sped off to Moisant International Airport. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a plane from the Border Patrol took off from New Orleans with Carlos Marcello on board. His destination, Guatemala City. The government was using his own fake birth certificate against him. They were deporting him to the country he had falsely claimed was his birthplace. Marcello's lawyers were frantic. They tried to get a judge to make an emergency order to stop the deportation. But by the time they could even reach a judge, their client was already on the airplane. The American Civil Liberties Union strongly criticized the government's action. They called it the kind of thing totalitarian governments do. They pointed out that Marcello had been denied his most basic right to talk to a lawyer. Bobby Kennedy was not sorry at all. When reporters asked him about the deportation, he said it had been done exactly according to the law. The Attorney General had finally gotten rid of the man he considered one of the most dangerous criminals in America. But if Kennedy thought he had heard the last of Carlos Marcello, he was very, very wrong. Carlos Marcello landed in Guatemala City with nothing except the clothes he was wearing. The American government had not even let him pack a bag. He was dropped off at the airport like a piece of unwanted trash. But Marcello was not without help. He had money, lots of it, hidden in bank accounts that the government knew nothing about. He had contacts all over the Americas, and he had an iron will that had carried him all the way from the poor neighborhoods of the French Quarter to the very top of organized crime. Within just a few hours of arriving, Marcello was spreading money around freely to Guatemalan officials. He bribed his way into a hotel room. He bribed his way out of jail when the authorities briefly locked him up. And he started planning how to get back to the United States. He even tried to set up some legal businesses in Central America. Maybe he was thinking he could build a new life for himself as a respectable businessman in another country. But Robert Kennedy was not finished with him. The Attorney General put pressure on the Guatemalan government to force Marcello to leave. Kennedy made it very clear that any country that gave shelter to the mobster would have problems in its relationship with the United States. Guatemala depended on American money and support. They had almost no choice but to do what Kennedy wanted. In May 1961, Guatemalan officials came to Marcello's hotel and told him he was no longer welcome in their country. They did not send him back to the United States. That would have undone all of Kennedy's work. Instead, they put him in a military vehicle and drove him to the border with Honduras. What happened next was an ordeal that would have destroyed most men. Marcello and his lawyer, Mike Maroon, who had come from New Orleans to help him, were dropped off in the mountainous jungle along the border between Guatemala and Honduras. They were told to start walking. The land was brutal. There was thick, tropical plants everywhere. The hillsides were steep. There were no roads or paths to follow. Marcello was 51 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in air-conditioned offices and restaurants. He was not used to cutting his way through a jungle. He was wearing a silk suit and dress shoes, which were completely wrong for that kind of environment. For 3 days, Marcello and Maroon struggled through the wilderness. They had no food, no water, and no supplies of any kind. Marcello collapsed 3 times from being completely exhausted. He broke several ribs when he fell. He was bitten by insects and threatened by the wild animals that lived in the mountains of Honduras. At one point, according to stories Marcello told later, he lay on the ground and was sure he was going to die. The man who controlled a criminal empire worth billions, who could order someone's death with just a word, who bought and sold politicians like they were farm animals, was helpless against nature's complete lack of concern for him. But Carlos Marcello did not die, somehow. He and Maroon stumbled out of the jungle and made their way to the small town of Copan Ruinas. From there, they traveled to San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. Marcello used his connections to arrange for a place to stay temporarily. The whole terrible experience had lasted about 17 days. When pictures of Marcello in Central America reached the American newspapers, they showed a man who looked completely different. He looked tired and worn out. He had not shaved, and he was wearing wrinkled clothes. He did not look at all like the well-dressed mobster who had been grabbed in New Orleans. But the fire in his eyes was still burning. If anything, the nightmare in the jungle had made his hatred for the man responsible even stronger. That man was Robert F. Kennedy. Within 2 months of being deported, Carlos Marcello was back in the United States. Exactly how he managed to get back into the country is still a little unclear. It seems he flew to Miami on a regular commercial flight using a passport from the Dominican Republic. Then he quietly made his way back to New Orleans. The government was furious, but there was not much they could do about it. Marcello was now in the country illegally. He could be arrested and deported again at any time. But arresting him would mean starting the whole process over from the beginning. And there was still no guarantee that any other country would accept him. Guatemala certainly would not take him back. Honduras wanted nothing to do with him. The government faced the ridiculous situation of deporting him over and over to countries that would just force him to leave again. And so began a legal game of cat and mouse that would drag on for years. Marcello was arrested and released on bail. Then he was arrested again and released again. His lawyers filed one motion after another, one appeal after another. They challenged the government's right to deport him. They demanded a hearing about his claims to citizenship. The case moved through the federal courts at an incredibly slow pace. Meanwhile, Marcello went back to running his empire. The deportation had been embarrassing and physically exhausting, but it had not hurt his organization at all. His brothers and other partners had kept everything running smoothly while he was gone. The slot machines were still taking in money. The gambling places were still open. The money was still flowing in. But something had changed inside Carlos Marcello. The deportation, which he always called the kidnapping, had humiliated him in front of his fellow criminals and his enemies. He had been grabbed and pushed around by federal agents like a common criminal. He had been dropped off in a foreign country and left to die in the jungle. And the man responsible was Bobby Kennedy, according to many different people who would later tell their stories. Marcello started talking about getting revenge. Not just legal revenge, not just political revenge. He was talking about something much more basic, something permanent. In September 1962, Carlos Marcello had a meeting at his Churchill Farms property outside of New Orleans. One of the people there was Edward Becker. Becker was a businessman and also worked sometimes as a private investigator. He had been introduced to Marcello by someone they both knew. The official reason for the meeting was to talk about a business idea, but soon the conversation turned to other subjects. According to what Becker later said when he testified in front of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Marcello became very upset when the subject of Robert Kennedy came up. The mobster's face got dark, and he started yelling against the Attorney General. Li vav livaria Petra di la Scarpa, Marcello reportedly said in Sicilian. The phrase means, "Take the stone out of my shoe." Becker understood this to be a traditional Sicilian expression. It meant to get rid of an annoyance permanently. But Marcello was not finished. He explained what he meant using a comparison that Becker would never forget. "You don't cut off a dog's tail to kill it," Marcello explained. "You cut off the head and the tail dies with it." The meaning was completely clear. Bobby Kennedy was the tail. He was the attack dog that President John F. Kennedy had sent after organized crime. But if you killed Bobby, you would only make people see him as a hero, and you would bring a huge wave of revenge down on yourself. The smart move was to kill the head. President Kennedy himself, with JFK dead, Bobby would lose all his power. A new president would have his own priorities and his own attorney general. The war against Marcello would finally end. Becker was shocked, but he kept his cool. He had accidentally stumbled into something much bigger than a simple business meeting. He had just heard a Mafia boss talking about murdering the President of the United States. According to Becker, Marcello went even further. He said that if you were going to have Kennedy killed, he would use someone who could not be connected to him. He would use a nut, someone with no obvious ties to organized crime. This person could be set up to take the blame. That way, even if the killer was caught or killed himself, the trail of evidence would not lead back to Marcello. Becker did not say anything at the time. He left the meeting as soon as he could. Later, he would claim that he reported what he had heard to the FBI, but there is no record of any such report in the FBI's files. Whether Becker actually went to the authorities and whether they ignored his warning is still something people argue about. What is not argued about is that 14 months later, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was a man who had known connections to New Orleans, and through his family, he had connections to people who were close to Carlos Marcello. The morning of November 22, 1963, Carlos Marcello arrived at the federal courthouse in New Orleans. He was there to hear the verdict in his trial. The government had charged him with conspiring to cheat the United States and with perjury. These charges came from his false Guatemalan birth certificate. It was not a major case. It was certainly not as serious as the deportation proceedings that were still hanging over him. But it was another front in the Kennedy administration's war against him. Marcello sat at the defense table, surrounded by his lawyers. He had sat through countless court appearances over the years. He showed no signs of worry, even though the outcome was important. If he was found guilty, it could mean years in prison, and it would certainly make the government's case for deporting him much stronger. The jury had been discussing the case since the day before. Now, as the hours passed, Marcello waited. The courtroom was tense with anticipation. At approximately 12:30 p.m. Central Time, at the very same moment that shots were being fired in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, the jury sent a message that they had reached a decision. The foreman of the jury stood up and announced the verdict. Not guilty on all charges, Carlos Marcello had won. The government's case against him had failed. Bobby Kennedy's personal war had been dealt another blow. But the celebration did not last long. Within just moments of the verdict being announced, news started to spread through the courtroom. There had been a shooting in Dallas. The President of the United States had been shot. John F. Kennedy was dead. The courthouse erupted into chaos. People rushed to find telephones to call their families. To find out more about what had happened, the whole nation was in shock. Its young president had been killed in the prime of his life, and Carlos Marcello, according to people who were there, showed absolutely no emotion at all. His face was like a mask. He gathered his lawyers together and left the courthouse without saying a single word. The coincidence was truly remarkable, maybe the most remarkable in all of American political history. On the very same day that President Kennedy was murdered, the man who had threatened to take the stone out of his shoe was found not guilty of federal charges. Two events, separated by hundreds of miles, happening within just a few hours of each other. Coincidence? Or something much more evil? Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans in 1939. He spent a large part of his troubled life in that city. His childhood was very chaotic. His father died before he was even born. His mother, Marguerite, had a hard time providing for him. The family moved around a lot. Young Lee was passed between relatives, foster homes, and his mother's care. One of the relatives who was very important in Oswald's life was his uncle, Charles Dutz Morit. Dutz was married to Lee's aunt, Lillian. The Morits helped take care of Leigh during several difficult times in his childhood. Lee lived with them sometimes and stayed in touch with them throughout his life. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Charles Dutz Morit was a bookmaker. He ran a sports betting operation in the New Orleans gambling underworld, by all accounts. He was connected to the criminal organization that was controlled by Carlos Marcello. Exactly what kind of relationship Morit had with Marcello is something people still argue about. Some investigators believe he was a fairly unimportant figure. He was just a small-time bookie with no direct connection to the boss himself. Others have argued that he was more important. They say his connections went higher up in the organization. What nobody argues about is that Dutz Morit operated in Marcello's territory. That meant he existed there only because Marcello allowed it, and he probably paid some of his profits to the organization. So Lee Harvey Oswald grew up very close to Carlos Marcello's criminal empire. This does not mean that Oswald knew Marcello, or that Marcello personally recruited him, but it does show a connection. It is a link between the man who killed President Kennedy and the man who had threatened to do exactly that. There is another connection as well: David Ferrie. David William Ferrie was one of the strangest characters in a case that was already full of strange characters. He was a former airline pilot who had lost his job because of accusations about his private life. Ferrie was a man with many different interests and obsessions. He was an amateur scientist who did cancer research in his own apartment. He was a captain in the Civil Air Patrol who worked with young cadets. He was a strong anti-communist who got involved with groups of Cubans in exile who wanted to overthrow Fidel Castro. And he was employed by Carlos Marcello's lawyer, G. Ray Gill. Ferrie worked as an investigator for Gill. In 1955, when Lee Harvey Oswald was a teenager in New Orleans, he joined the Civil Air Patrol, according to many different witnesses and at least one photograph. The unit he joined was led by Captain David Ferrie. Whether Ferrie and Oswald actually developed a relationship during this time is something people argue about. Some witnesses said they were close. Others said they barely even talked to each other. What is not argued about is that by 1963, David Ferrie was working directly for Carlos Marcello. He was an investigator for Gill. Ferrie helped with Marcello's defense against the government's attempts to deport him and with his other legal problems. On November 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination, Ferry was in a New Orleans courtroom. He was there with Carlos Marcello, waiting to hear the verdict in Marcello's conspiracy trial. After the assassination, Ferry's behavior became very strange. He immediately went on a weird trip to Texas. He drove through a violent thunderstorm to Houston and then to Galveston. He claimed he was going ice skating and hunting for geese, but his explanation did not convince many investigators. The timing of the trip and where he was going, towards Dallas, towards the place where the assassination had happened, raised obvious questions. The New Orleans District Attorney's Office briefly held Ferry for questioning, but they released him when the FBI said they were not interested in pursuing the matter. It was not until 1967 that Ferry became a focus of public attention. That was when New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison started his own investigation into the assassination. On February 22, 1967, just a few days after Garrison publicly named him as a suspect, David Ferry was found dead in his apartment. The coroner said he died of natural causes, a brain hemorrhage. But the timing seemed impossibly convenient. Ferry had been talking about writing a book. He had been hinting that he had information that could completely change the case. And then he was dead. The truth about David Ferry's role in the Kennedy assassination, if he had any role at all, died with him on November 24, 1963, 2 days after President Kennedy's death. Americans witnessed another shocking murder on live television. Lee Harvey Oswald was in the custody of the Dallas police. They were moving him to a more secure facility. As he walked through the basement of the police station, surrounded by police officers and reporters, a man stepped out of the crowd. He pulled out a pistol and shot Oswald in the stomach. The shooter was Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner from Dallas. He was immediately arrested. He would later be found guilty of murder. The Warren Commission, which was the official investigation into Kennedy's assassination, decided that Ruby had acted alone. They said he acted on impulse. They said he was motivated by sadness over the president's death and a desire to save Jackie Kennedy from the pain of an Oswald trial. Ruby himself stuck to this story until he died of cancer in 1967. But investigators who looked more closely at Ruby's background found connections that the Warren Commission either missed or simply ignored. Jack Ruby was born Jacob Leon Rubenstein in Chicago in 1911. He grew up in a tough neighborhood. He developed connections to organized crime at a very young age. In the 1940s and 1950s, he worked at various jobs in Chicago and Dallas. Eventually, he settled in Dallas and opened a few nightclubs. Ruby's clubs, the Vegas Club and the Carousel Club, were in an area of Dallas that had many connections to organized crime. Remember, Dallas was effectively an extension of Carlos Marcello's territory in New Orleans. Gambling, prostitution, and other illegal businesses in Dallas operated with Marcello's approval and under his ultimate control. Many different witnesses said that Ruby had connections to organized crime figures. He was seen with known mobsters. He made phone calls to people who were connected to major crime families. He traveled to Cuba during a time when casinos connected to the mob were operating there. By all appearances, he was a man on the edges of the criminal underworld. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which investigated Kennedy's murder again in the late 1970s, found that Ruby had made a series of phone calls to organized crime figures in the weeks before the assassination. The calls included contacts with people connected to Jimmy Hoffa and with individuals connected to Carlos Marcello's organization. Why would a Dallas nightclub owner be calling these people? The Warren Commission's picture of Ruby as just a simple, grief-stricken patriot does not easily fit with these connections. The question that haunted investigators was obvious. Was Jack Ruby sent to silence Lee Harvey Oswald? Was the man who killed Kennedy's killer actually part of a larger plot? Ruby went to his grave insisting that he acted alone. But in one of his last interviews, he hinted darkly that there was more to the story. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, he said. My motive, the people who had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in the position I'm in, will never let the true facts come above board to the world. When he was asked who these people were, Ruby refused to say. He died of cancer on January 3, 1967, less than a month before David Ferrie, the Warren Commission, which was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, released its report in September 1964. The conclusion was very clear. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting completely alone, had assassinated President Kennedy. Jack Ruby, acting completely alone, had killed Oswald. There was no conspiracy of any kind. The report was almost 900 pages long. It was supported by 26 volumes of evidence and testimony. It was meant to be the final definitive word on the tragedy. It was supposed to be a complete investigation that would answer all questions forever. It did nothing of the sort. Almost immediately, critics started attacking the Warren Commission's findings. They pointed to things in the evidence that did not make sense. They talked about witnesses who had been ignored or whose stories had been dismissed. They talked about leads that had not been followed. They pointed out that the FBI, which did most of the actual investigation, had been very eager to close the case quickly. They had not always followed the evidence wherever it led. The critics raised disturbing questions. How could Oswald, who was only an average shooter, have fired 3 shots so accurately in just a few seconds? Why did the path of the bullets seem to defy the laws of physics? This required what critics mockingly called the magic bullet theory. Why had Oswald been allowed to walk into the Texas School Book Depository with a rifle without anyone noticing? Why had Jack Ruby been able to walk into the basement of the Dallas Police Department, walk past dozens of police officers, and shoot the most important prisoner in America? And most troubling of all, had the investigation really looked hard enough at the possibility that organized crime was involved? The Warren Commission knew about Oswald's connections to New Orleans and his uncle's gambling activities. They knew that Ruby had connections to the criminal underworld, but they did not investigate these connections very deeply. They accepted the FBI's word that there was no Mafia conspiracy, and they moved on. For 15 years, the Warren Commission's conclusions were considered the official truth, but doubts kept growing. Polls consistently showed that most Americans did not believe that Oswald had acted alone. Books that questioned the Commission's findings became bestsellers. Oliver Stone's movie JFK would later bring these theories to millions more people. And then in 1976, Congress decided to take another look. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was created in 1976. Its job was to reinvestigate the murders of President Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The committee had the power to order people to testify. They had access to secret documents, and they were told to follow the evidence wherever it led. What they found was deeply troubling. The committee concluded that President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. This was based on sound evidence. There were recordings that seemed to capture 4 gunshots, not the 3 that Oswald could have fired. The committee believed there was a second gunman in Dealey Plaza. Oswald had not acted alone, but who were the people working with him? The committee investigated several possibilities. These included Cuban exiles, anti-Castro militants, and organized crime. When it came to organized crime, the committee focused on 2 men, Santo Trafficante Jr. of Tampa and Carlos Marcello of New Orleans. The committee found that both men had a reason to want Kennedy dead. The ability to do it, and the chance to make it happen. Trafficante had lost his very profitable Cuban casinos when Castro came to power. He blamed the Kennedy administration for not supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion, which might have brought back the old government. Marcello had been kidnapped and dropped in the Guatemalan jungle by Robert Kennedy. He was also facing constant legal attacks. Carlos Marcello was called to testify in front of the committee on January 11, 1978. True to his nature, he denied everything. "Did you ever discuss anything about any plan to assassinate President Kennedy?" A committee investigator asked. "Absolutely not," Marcello replied. "No. Did you ever personally have anything to do with his death?" "Absolutely not." The committee asked him about the things he had said to Edward Becker. They asked him about his threat to take the stone out of his shoe. Marcello denied ever saying anything like that. "I never said anything like that," he insisted. The committee also asked Marcello about his relationship to Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle. "That's Morit." Marcello admitted that he knew Morit. "I think he's got a little booking business," he said, but he denied any deeper connection. In its final report, the committee was careful, but their meaning was clear. They could not find direct proof that Marcello had ordered Kennedy's assassination, but they decided that he had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to do so. The evidence suggested it was possible, even if it was not completely proven. The committee found that Marcello had the motive, means, and opportunity to have President John F. Kennedy assassinated. The report stated, even though it was unable to find direct proof of Marcello's involvement, this was a remarkable finding. A congressional committee was saying that a Mafia boss probably could have killed the president, even if they could not prove that he actually did. For all practical purposes, the Warren Commission's lone gunman theory was dead. But the real truth was still out of reach. Carlos Marcello went back to New Orleans. He went back to his empire. He went back to his secrets. The mystery of November 22, 1963, would continue to trouble American history. With John F. Kennedy dead and Robert Kennedy stripped of his power, the pressure on Carlos Marcello eased a great deal. President Lyndon Johnson had his own priorities. Going after the New Orleans mob boss was not one of them. Bobby Kennedy stayed on as Attorney General for a little while, but he was a broken man, completely devastated by his brother's death. He resigned in September 1964 to run for the U.S. Senate from New York for Carlos Marcello. The years that followed were like a golden age. His empire did better than ever before. The slot machines kept humming. The gambling places kept making money. The money flowed in like rivers. He made his real estate holdings bigger. He developed his Churchill Farms property. He invested in legal businesses all over Louisiana and beyond. Marcello kept his alliances with other major crime families. He worked together with Trafficante in Tampa and Giacana in Chicago. He went to the National Commission meetings, where the families divided up territories and settled arguments. By any measure, he was one of the most powerful organized crime figures in all of America. In 1966, Marcello showed just how untouchable he had become. On September 22nd, federal agents arrested him along with 12 other mob leaders at La Stella restaurant in Queens. New York, the gathering, which became known as the Little Appalachian Meeting after the famous 1957 mob meeting, was supposed to be proof of a national criminal conspiracy. The charges were eventually dropped. The government could not prove that anything illegal had actually happened at the dinner. Marcello flew back to New Orleans, feeling triumphant once again. But at the New Orleans airport, something happened that showed the explosive temper that was hidden beneath Marcello's calm surface. An FBI agent approached him, apparently to ask him questions about the New York meeting. Marcello, right in front of many witnesses, punched the agent right in the face. It was an incredibly stupid thing to do. Hitting a federal agent was a serious crime, and Marcello had done it right in front of many people who saw it. He was arrested, put on trial, and found guilty. The sentence was 2 years in federal prison. Even this conviction showed how much influence Marcello had. More than 30 important citizens of Louisiana wrote letters to the court. They were businessmen, community leaders, important people in society. They all said what a fine person Marcello was. They asked the judge to be lenient. The judge, maybe impressed by all this support, allowed Marcello to stay free while he appealed the decision for several years. When he finally did go to prison, it was for only 6 months. 6 months for punching a federal agent. Most people would have gotten years in prison. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, Carlos Marcello ran what was essentially a shadow government in Louisiana. His influence reached into every level of the state's political system, from local sheriffs all the way to the governor's mansion. One example of his power involved the Louisiana State Police. According to testimony given later, Marcello met regularly with the head of the state police. Officially, it was to give advice on security. In reality, these meetings let Marcello keep track of what law enforcement was doing. They made sure that his own operations were not being targeted. Marcello's relationships with the governors, who came one after another, were not really a secret. He gave money to their campaigns. Sometimes he did it openly. Sometimes through other people. He did favors for them, and he expected favors in return. When he needed a pardon for someone, or a parole, or a government contract to be given to a friendly business, the governor's office was usually happy to help. The amount of political corruption was truly shocking. A later investigation by the FBI would show that Marcello had paid bribes to politicians at every single level of Louisiana government. Judges, state legislators, sheriffs, police officers. They were all on his payroll, either directly or indirectly. He did not control every politician in the state, but he controlled enough of them to keep his own interests safe. All the while, Marcello kept insisting that he was nothing but a symbol. Honest businessman, I'm just a poor tomato salesman, he would say when people asked him how he got so rich. The tomato business was real enough. Marcello did sell tomatoes, but it was only a tiny part of his actual income. The real money came from his illegal businesses, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and drugs. The drug trade was especially profitable. New Orleans, with its busy port and its closeness to Latin America, was a perfect place for drugs to come into the United States. Marcello was very careful to stay far away from actually handling the drugs themselves. But the evidence strongly suggests that his organization made a huge amount of money from this trade. Carlos Marcello was different from most major mafia figures in one important way. He kept his family life remarkably stable and normal, while other mob bosses went through multiple marriages, had affairs, and created chaos in their personal lives. Marcello stayed devoted to his wife, Jacqueline, throughout their whole marriage. The couple raised 4 children together: Louise, Joseph, Florence, and Jacqueline, who was named after her mother. They lived in a comfortable but not showy home in Metairie. They had a lifestyle that was rich, but deliberately not flashy. Marcello did not show off his wealth the way some gangsters did. There were no fancy cars, no gaudy mansions. No public displays of having too much money. This was partly just his personal preference. Marcello genuinely seemed to like a quiet life, and it was partly a smart strategy. The less attention he drew to himself, the harder it was for law enforcement to build a case against him. He put his businesses in the names of his relatives and friends. He claimed to have a modest income on his tax returns. He lived, at least in public, well within the money he appeared to have. His brothers played important roles in his organization. Joseph Jr. was a trusted lieutenant. He helped manage the family's legal businesses. Anthony took care of various operational matters. In many ways, the Marcello family was a classic immigrant success story. The only difference was that their success was built on crime. Marcello was also very careful about how his organization was set up. Unlike some mafia families that made dozens or even hundreds of new members, Marcello kept his family small and tight. At times, there were as few as 4 or 5 made men in the New Orleans organization. This made the family much harder for the police to get into. It also reduced the chance that an unhappy member would become an informant. This strategy worked for decades. No one from inside the organization ever turned against Carlos Marcello. The wall of silence, omerta, stayed strong. Law enforcement knew who he was and what he did, but they could not prove it. The year 1968 brought more tragedy to America and to the Kennedy family. On June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy, who had reinvented himself as a senator and was now running for president, was shot and killed at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. It happened just moments after he won the California Democratic primary. The killer was Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian immigrant. He claimed he was angry because Kennedy supported Israel. There was no obvious connection to organized crime. There was no evidence that Sirhan was anything other than a lone gunman, driven by his own political beliefs. And yet, the timing was still remarkable. Bobby Kennedy had been very close to winning the Democratic nomination for president. If he had lived, he might very well have won the general election. And if he had won, he would have been in a position to start a new investigation into his brother's death. That investigation might have led straight to Carlos Marcello. People who believe in conspiracy theories have spent endless time thinking about possible connections between RFK's murder and organized crime. They point to things in the evidence that do not make sense. They talk about witnesses who claimed there was a second gunman. They talk about the strange circumstances surrounding Sirhan's mental state, but no believable evidence has ever been found that links Sirhan to the Mafia or to Carlos Marcello. What is certain is that Bobby Kennedy's death removed the last major threat to Marcello's empire. The man who had made it his personal mission to destroy the New Orleans mob boss was gone. There would be no final accounting, no final confrontation, no justice. Carlos Marcello had outlived both Kennedy brothers. His empire was safe. His secrets were safe. By the late 1970s, Carlos Marcello was almost 70 years old. He had been the boss of New Orleans for more than 3 decades. That was an almost unheard of length of time in the violent world of organized crime. He had survived attempts on his life, federal investigations, deportation, and the Kennedy crusade. He seemed impossible to defeat. But the world was changing around him. The FBI, which for so long had pretended organized crime did not exist, had now made the Mafia a top priority. New laws, especially the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, gave prosecutors powerful new tools to attack criminal enterprises. And a new generation of mobsters, who did not feel as bound by the old codes of loyalty, were starting to cooperate with the police in exchange for lighter sentences. In 1979, a man named Joseph Hauser approached Carlos Marcello with a business idea. Hauser had been found guilty of insurance fraud. He claimed to have connections in the world of corrupt insurance deals. He suggested a plan to bribe Louisiana officials in exchange for getting valuable state insurance contracts. What Marcello did not know was that Hauser was wearing a hidden recording device. The FBI had turned him into an informant. Everything Marcello said was being recorded. The operation was called Brillub, which was short for bribery labor. For over a year, FBI agents recorded hundreds of hours of conversations with Marcello and his associates. They captured discussions of bribes, kickbacks, and corrupt deals. They documented the inner workings of Marcello's organization in more detail than ever before. Most dramatically, the recordings captured something that Marcello had always denied, that he was a member of the Mafia. In one recorded conversation, Marcello admitted that he was mafioso. It was his own shorthand for the organization he had always said did not exist. The Brillub investigation was one of the most successful undercover operations in FBI history. It would bring down not only Marcello, but also Louisiana's Commissioner of Administration, Charles Raymer, and other public officials. The corruption that everyone knew existed was finally captured on tape. In June 1980, Carlos Marcello was formally charged with multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and mail and wire fraud. The Brillub tapes were devastating. Marcello's own words, captured on the recordings, described his criminal activities and his bribing of public officials. The trial began in August 1981. For the first time in his long career, Marcello faced prosecution with real evidence against him. This was not like his earlier trials, where the government had to rely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony that could be attacked or discredited. This time, they had his own voice on tape. Marcello's lawyers fought hard. They challenged whether the wiretaps were legal. They questioned how believable Hauser was as a witness. But the recordings spoke for themselves. On August 4, 1981, Carlos Marcello was found guilty on all charges. The conviction was stunning. After decades of escaping justice, the godfather of New Orleans had finally been brought down. But Marcello's legal problems were only just beginning. While the Brillub case was happening in Louisiana, federal prosecutors in California had been building a separate case against Marcello. This case involved accusations that Marcello had plotted to bribe a federal judge in Los Angeles. He wanted to get a favorable decision in an insurance fraud case. The evidence, once again, came from recorded conversations. In April 1982, Marcello was found guilty in the California case as well. Now he faced 2 sets of federal convictions, and he faced the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The sentences were harsh. In January 1982, Marcello received 7 years for the Brillub conviction. After the California conviction, he received an additional 10 years. The sentences were to be served one after the other. That meant Marcello, who was now 73 years old, was facing 17 years in federal prison. Marcello's lawyers started a furious effort to appeal the decisions. They argued that the wiretaps had been illegal. They said their client had been tricked by government informants. The appeals dragged on for months and years. Marcello stayed free on bail. He continued to live in his home in Metairie, while his lawyers fought in the courts. But by April 1983, all the appeals had been exhausted. Carlos Marcello, the man who had ruled Louisiana's underworld for 36 years, was finally going to prison. On April 15, 1983, Carlos Marcello went to the Federal Correctional Institution in Texarkana, Texas, to begin serving his sentence. It was a medium security prison. It was not the brutal maximum security places where the most dangerous criminals are sent. But for a man who had lived his entire adult life in freedom and luxury, it was a huge fall. Marcello adjusted to prison life with the same calm strength that had carried him through the horrible Guatemalan jungle 2 decades earlier. He mostly kept to himself. He stayed out of the prison politics and power struggles that consumed other inmates. He was 73 years old. His health was getting worse. He had very little interest in proving anything to anyone. But even in prison, Marcello could not completely escape his past. Other inmates knew who he was. He was the legendary mob boss, the man who had supposedly ordered the murder of a president. Some tried to get on his good side. Others kept their distance. The guards treated him with careful respect. It was during this time in prison that Marcello supposedly made statements that would bring the Kennedy assassination controversy back to life. According to Jack Van Lanningham, a fellow prisoner who later claimed he had been working as an FBI informant, Marcello shared details about his role in the Kennedy assassination. Van Lanningham said that Marcello bragged about setting up President Kennedy's murder. He described how he had arranged for Oswald to be in the right place. He said he had used people in between, so the assassination could never be traced back to him. Van Lanningham's account was never completely proven. People have questioned whether it is believable. Informants in prison are notoriously unreliable. They often exaggerate or even make things up, hoping to get special treatment. And Marcello, by the time of these supposed confessions, was starting to show signs of mental decline. But Van Lanningham's story added to the growing amount of circumstantial evidence that linked Marcello to the Kennedy assassination. It was either another piece of the puzzle or another false lead, depending on who you asked. While Carlos Marcello sat in his prison cell in Texarkana, his criminal empire was falling apart. The Brilab convictions had not only sent Marcello to prison, they had also exposed his whole network of corruption. They sent a very clear message that Louisiana was no longer a safe place for organized crime. Marcello had left his brother Joseph in charge of the family's operations while he was gone. But Joseph did not have Carlos's combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and political connections. He could not hold the organization together. The gambling operations that had been the foundation of Marcello's empire started to shrink. Law enforcement, encouraged by the success of Brilab, started cracking down on illegal casinos and betting places. Politicians who had once been happy to take Marcello's money now kept their distance. They were afraid of getting caught up in future investigations. The carefully built network of corruption and protection that Marcello had spent decades creating started to fall apart. At the same time, the legal businesses that Marcello had used to hide his criminal money faced their own problems. The real estate empire, the tomato farms, the shrimp boats, all needed management and attention that the imprisoned Marcello could not give them. By the middle of the 1980s, the New Orleans Mafia was just a shadow of what it used to be. The once powerful organization that had controlled gambling, labor unions, and political corruption all across Louisiana and Texas was now just a handful of aging gangsters. They were struggling just to keep control of their shrinking territory. The era of Carlos Marcello was ending. Even if the man himself was still alive in prison, in early 1989, Carlos Marcello had a series of strokes while he was in prison. The strokes left him physically weak and mentally damaged. Guards and other prisoners noticed that the once sharp crime boss was becoming confused. He was forgetting names and events. He had trouble following conversations. Doctors diagnosed Marcello with Alzheimer's disease. It is a cruel illness that slowly destroys memory and personality. The man who had kept so many secrets, who knew the truth about so many crimes, was losing his grip on his own mind. At the same time, Marcello's lawyers had kept fighting their appeals. In July 1989, they won a major victory. The Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned his bralab conviction. They said there had been procedural problems. The court found that the government had made mistakes in the prosecution. These mistakes meant he deserved a new trial. The government now had a difficult choice. They could try Marcello again, but the main witness, Joseph Hauser, was becoming more and more unreliable, and Marcello himself was clearly suffering from dementia. A new trial would be expensive and difficult, and it might not even result in a conviction. The other choice was to let Marcello go. They could let an old, sick man spend his last days at home with his family. In October 1989, Carlos Marcello was released from federal custody. He had served 6 years and 6 months of his 17-year sentence. He went back to his home in Metairie. His wife, Jacqueline, and his children took care of him. Coming home was a bittersweet feeling. Marcello was free. But he was not the same man he had once been. The sharp mind that had built an empire outsmarted investigators, and maybe even planned the murder of a president was fading away. He spent his days in a fog, looked after by nurses. Sometimes old friends who came to pay their respects to a dying king would visit him. The Carlos Marcello, who came back to Metairie in 1989, looked almost nothing like the feared crime boss of earlier decades. He was 79 years old, weak and more confused. The Alzheimer's disease kept getting worse. It stole more of his memory and thinking ability with every passing month. His wife, Jacqueline, who had stood by him through decades of criminal activity, legal battles, and public attention, now gave all her time to caring for him. Their children also came together to help. The family closed ranks to protect their father in his final decline. The house in Metairie became a quiet place. The parade of politicians, businessmen, and fellow criminals who had once sought Marcello's favor stopped coming. The phone calls from associates asking for advice or approval became fewer and fewer, and then they stopped completely. The man who had controlled the fate of thousands of people was now completely dependent on others for even his most basic needs. Sometimes reporters or investigators would try to reach Marcello. They hoped to get some final confession or revelation from him. But by this time, he was beyond being able to communicate in any meaningful way. Whatever secrets he still had about Kennedy, about decades of crime and corruption, about the true nature of his power, were locked away in a mind that could no longer reach them. Some people who knew Marcello wondered what might have been if he had lived in different times or chosen a different path. He was undeniably intelligent. He had a strategic mind and an ability to understand people that would have served him well in legal business or politics. But he had been born into poverty, into a world where crime seemed to offer the fastest way to power and respect. He had made his choices, and those choices had shaped his entire life. Others felt no such sympathy for him at all. To them, Marcello was simply a criminal. He was a murderer, someone who corrupted others, a man who had poisoned Louisiana's political system and possibly ordered the murder of an American president. His declining health and sad final years were just punishment for a life of evil. While Carlos Marcello was fading into silence, the New Orleans Mafia tried to reorganize under new leadership. In 1991, Anthony Corallo, the son of the deported Silver Dollar Sam Corallo, took control of what was left of the family, but there was very little left to control. The organization that Marcello had built was effectively destroyed. The gambling operations were gone. They had been shut down by law enforcement or driven out of business by competition from legal casinos that were starting to appear in Louisiana. The political connections had dried up. The network of corruption and protection that had made Marcello untouchable had been taken apart. Corallo and the few remaining members struggled to keep some kind of presence in the New Orleans underworld. But they were a pale shadow of the Marcello era. The great days of the New Orleans Mafia were over. The decline of the New Orleans family was part of a larger trend in American organized crime. All across the country, the Mafia was losing its grip. The RICO laws had devastated the major families. The old code of silence, omerta, was breaking down. More and more mobsters were choosing to cooperate with the police rather than face long prison sentences. The ethnic neighborhoods that had once provided cover and new members for the Mafia were disappearing as people moved away and blended into American society. Carlos Marcello had been one of the last of the old-time bosses. They were men who had built their empires during the Prohibition era and ruled them for decades. When he died, an era would die with him, as Marcello's life was coming to an end. The question of whether he was involved in the Kennedy assassination continued to cause controversy and investigation. Books were written, documentaries were made, theories were proposed and argued about. The mystery seemed like it would last forever. The circumstantial case against Marcello was still strong. He had a reason to want Kennedy dead. The Kennedy brothers had made his life miserable. They had deported him, prosecuted him, and threatened to destroy everything he had built. He had the ability to do it. His organization had connections to Dallas, to Lee Harvey Oswald's family, and to Jack Ruby's world. He had the opportunity. The assassination happened in territory that was under his influence, and there were the supposed confessions. Edward Becker's account of Marcello's threat to take the stone out of my shoe. Jack Van Laningham's claim that Marcello had bragged in prison about planning the assassination. And other, less well-documented stories of things Marcello had supposedly said to various people over the years. But strong circumstantial evidence is not the same as proof. The House Select Committee on Assassinations had decided that Marcello had the motive, means, and opportunity, but they also clearly stated that they could not find direct evidence of his involvement. No witness ever came forward with first-hand knowledge of Marcello ordering or planning the assassination. No documents were ever found that linked him directly to the crime. People who still believed the lone gunman theory pointed out that Oswald had his own reasons for killing Kennedy. He was a troubled, unstable man with delusions of grandeur and a history of violence. Ruby might have simply been what he claimed to be, a patriotic nightclub owner who acted on impulse. The connections between these men and Marcello's organization, while real, might have been just coincidences. Not proof of a plot. The truth, whatever it may be, may never be known for certain. Carlos Marcello took his secrets with him to the grave. On March 2, 1993, Carlos Marcello died peacefully in his sleep at his home in Metairie. He was 83 years old. The news of his death was announced quietly, without any big show. The man who had once been in the headlines and caused fear all across Louisiana only got small obituaries in the newspapers. The world had moved on. New villains had appeared to capture the public's attention. Carlos Marcello was yesterday's news. The funeral was private. Only family and close friends came. Marcello was buried in Metairie Cemetery, not far from the home where he had lived for so many years. There were no fancy tributes, no processions of black limousines, no public displays of grief. He was laid to rest quietly, just as he had lived, at least in public, quietly. Federal authorities estimated that Marcello's wealth at the time he was released from prison was about $30 million. This was almost certainly only a small part of what he had made during his career. But the Brillub conviction, the legal fees, and the collapse of his empire had taken their toll. Still, $30 million was more than enough to make sure his family would be comfortable for generations. The legacy he left behind was much more complicated than any amount of money could show. Marcello had built an organization that controlled Louisiana for almost 50 years. He had corrupted the political system of an entire state. He had made himself and his partners incredibly rich. And he had probably according to some, arranged the murder of the President of the United States. He was definitely a villain, a criminal who caused terrible harm to countless victims. He was a man who lived outside the law and profited from the weaknesses and vices of other people. But he was also a product of his own time and circumstances. He was a poor immigrant's son who found that crime seemed to offer the only way out of poverty. He was not uniquely evil. He was a man who had chosen a path that millions of others in different situations might also have chosen. None of this excuses what he did, but it might help explain how Caballero Minor, the baby who crossed the Atlantic Ocean in his mother's arms, became Carlos Marcello, the godfather of New Orleans. In the years after Marcello's death, the New Orleans Mafia kept declining until it was no longer important. Anthony Corallo was still the leader of the family, but there was very little left to lead. The organization had no significant operations, no political influence, and no real power. It existed more as a historical curiosity than as a working criminal business. The larger trend in American organized crime continued as well. The great Mafia families that had dominated the Underworld for most of the 20th century were weakened by prosecutions, fights among themselves, and the changing nature of crime itself. New criminal organizations, like drug cartels, street gangs, and international groups, rose up to take their place. The Italian-American Mafia became just one player among many in the increasingly complicated world of organized crime. Louisiana was also changing. The culture of corruption that Marcello had taken advantage of and made worse did not disappear overnight. But it was slowly being challenged. Candidates who promised reform started winning elections. Investigative journalists exposed wrongdoing. Federal prosecutors kept going after corrupt officials. The comfortable relationship between organized crime and government that Marcello had perfected was becoming harder and harder to maintain. The introduction of legal gambling in Louisiana, like riverboat casinos, the New Orleans Casino, and video poker machines, actually helped reduce the power of illegal gambling. Why take a risk by playing in an illegal casino when you could gamble legally? The illegal business that had been the foundation of Marcello's empire was made mostly unnecessary by legalization. The mystery of the Kennedy assassination continued to create investigation and argument long after Marcello was gone. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. This law required that all government records related to the assassination be released to the public. The Assassination Records Review Board was created to carry out this law. They spent several years looking at and releasing millions of pages of documents. Many of these documents shed new light on the investigation, or, more accurately, they showed the failures and limits of the original investigation. The documents revealed that the Warren Commission had not been told about CIA plans to use Mafia figures, including Santo Trafficante, to kill Fidel Castro. They showed that the FBI had failed to share important information about Oswald's activities in the months before the assassination. They showed that the investigation had been influenced by political considerations and fights between different government agencies. But the documents did not solve the main mystery. No smoking gun was found. No memo proving that Marcello had ordered Kennedy's death. No confession from someone who was part of the plot. The circumstantial evidence was still strong, but it was still just circumstantial. Researchers kept digging. They found new witnesses, new connections, new pieces of the puzzle. Books kept being written. Documentaries kept being made. The Kennedy assassination became maybe the most investigated crime in all of American history. Yet, it remained unsolved, at least to the satisfaction of most Americans. The story of Carlos Marcello teaches lessons that go far beyond the specific details of organized crime in Louisiana. It is a story about the nature of power, how it is gained, how it is kept, and how it ultimately corrupts. Marcello understood that real power is not about violence. Even though violence may be necessary to get it, real power is about relationships. It is about making yourself useful to people who can help you. It is about making people dependent on you, people who might otherwise be your enemies. It is about building networks of favors and shared benefits that tie people to you more strongly than any chains ever could. This is why Marcello worked so hard to make friends with politicians, not just because he needed their protection, although he did, but because by corrupting them, he made them his partners. A politician who has taken a bribe can never go back. He cannot turn against the person who paid him without destroying himself. The relationship becomes permanent and unbreakable. Marcello also understood how important it was to appear legitimate, or at least to seem that way. He was never just a criminal. He was also a businessman, a property owner, someone who gave to charity. He gave money to charities, went to church, and raised his children to seem respectable. This legitimate image provided cover for his criminal activities. It also made it easier for the politicians and businessmen who dealt with him to convince themselves that what they were doing was okay. These techniques, corruption, building relationships, creating a legitimate image, are not unique to organized crime. They are the tools of power in all its forms. Politicians, business leaders, religious leaders, all use versions of these methods to build and keep their influence. Marcello was unusual only in how open and large-scale his corruption was, and in his willingness to use violence when other methods did not work. Carlos Marcello spent much of his life avoiding justice. He bought off politicians, he corrupted judges, he scared witnesses into silence. He built an organization designed to keep him safe from prosecution, to make sure he would never be caught holding the smoking gun. For decades, this strategy worked perfectly. He lived in freedom and luxury while committing or ordering crimes that hurt thousands of people. When justice finally did catch up with him, it was because of his own carelessness. The recorded conversations that were the basis for the Brillab prosecution. And even then, his punishment was relatively light. He served 6.5 years for crimes that, altogether, deserved much longer sentences. He died at home in his own bed, surrounded by his family. This outcome raises uncomfortable questions about the American justice system. How is it possible that a man who is identified as one of the worst criminals in the country by a Senate committee in 1951 was able to keep doing what he was doing for another, 30 years before facing serious consequences? How did he corrupt so many politicians, judges, and police officers without ever being held responsible for that corruption? How could he possibly have ordered the murder of a president and escape any punishment at all? The answers are complicated. They have a lot to do with the limits of law enforcement in a democratic society. Prosecutors can only bring charges that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Judges can only give sentences that are within the guidelines set by law. Police can only investigate crimes when they have the resources and political support to do so. Marcello understood these limits perfectly and took advantage of them masterfully. But the answers also show failures of will and honesty within the system itself. Police and officials who looked the other way because they were paid to, or because they were afraid of revenge, or because they just did not want to cause any trouble. Politicians who took Marcello's money and gave him protection because it was easier and more profitable than fighting him. Citizens who enjoyed the services Marcello provided, like gambling, prostitution, and the corruption that made Louisiana's economy run more smoothly, and who preferred not to ask too many questions in this way. Marcello's success was not just his own doing. It was a failure shared by many people. It was a conspiracy of silence and participation that went far beyond his own immediate organization. It is easy, when telling the story of a crime boss, to focus on the dramatic parts, the power struggles, the political corruption, the possible murder of a president. But behind all these dramatic events, there is a huge amount of human suffering that should not be forgotten. The victims of Carlos Marcello's empire were many. The gamblers who lost their life savings and their families to addiction. The workers whose unions were corrupted and used for the mob's benefit. The small business owners who had to pay protection money to avoid having their shops vandalized or destroyed. The drug addicts who destroyed their lives with the drugs that Marcello's organization brought into the country. The countless individuals whose lives were made worse or ended by violence that was ordered by Marcello. These victims almost never appear in the dramatic stories about organized crime. They are the nameless casualties of a system designed to make a few people rich at the expense of many. Their stories are not told because they are not glamorous or exciting, but their suffering was real, and it should be part of any fair judgment of Carlos Marcello's life. Louisiana itself was a victim. The corruption that Marcello encouraged and used held back the state's development. It took money away from public services and put it into private pockets. It created a culture of cynicism and giving up that made it very hard to create change. For generations, the people of Louisiana lived in a state where the government was for sale, where the rule of law was just a pretend idea, where honest citizens were at the mercy of criminals and their political friends. The cost of this corruption cannot be measured exactly, but it was huge. It meant better schools that were never built, roads that were never fixed, public services that were never provided, economic growth that never happened because investors were afraid of the corrupt environment. The cost of Marcello's time in power was beyond calculation. Carlos Marcello's life covered almost the entire 20th century. He was born in the last days of the Ottoman Empire and died as the Cold War was ending. He saw the huge changes brought by 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Digital Revolution. He lived through the rise and fall of the American Mafia, from its beginnings in the Prohibition era to its fading away at the end of the century. In many ways, his story is a very American story. It is an immigrant's tale of wanting to succeed and actually doing it, but it is twisted into a dark mirror of the American dream. He came to this country with nothing and built an empire. He started at the very bottom of society and fought his way to the very top in his own twisted way. He showed the values of relying on yourself, working hard, and being determined that Americans celebrate. But the American dream is supposed to lift everyone up. It is supposed to create chances for everyone who is willing to work for them. Marcello's version of the dream was a game where one person's win had to mean another person's loss. His success depended on using and hurting other people. He did not create wealth. He took it from others. He did not build institutions. He made them corrupt. His legacy is not a better society, but a more damaged one And yet, there is something about Marcello that makes people feel a kind of unwilling respect. He was not a hypocrite. He never pretended to be good. He understood the world as a harsh and competitive place, and he played by the rules he found there, not by the rules he wished existed. He was loyal to his family and his partners, even while he was breaking the larger agreement that holds society together. He faced hard times, like the deportation, the jungle ordeal, and the imprisonment, with a quiet courage. These are not good qualities that excuse his crimes, but they are clearly human qualities. And they help explain why stories about men like Marcello still fascinate us. We see in them a twisted reflection of our own desires and fears, our own ability to be both loyal and cruel. More than 30 years have passed since Carlos Marcello died in his Metairie home. The world he knew has been changed almost beyond recognition. The French Quarter, where he sold vegetables and committed his first crimes, is now a place for tourists. The slot machines that built his empire have been replaced by legal casinos. The politicians he once controlled have been replaced by generations of new people. Some honest, some not, but shadows of Marcello's influence still remain. The culture of corruption that he used and made worse has been very hard to get rid of completely. Louisiana still struggles with problems of honesty in government. Progress has been made. The political system that Marcello bent to his will has been reformed, but it is still open to the same pressures that he used so skillfully. And the mystery of November 22nd, 1963 is still unsolved, even after decades of investigation, millions of pages of released documents, and countless books and documentaries. We still do not know for sure who killed President Kennedy. The Warren Commission's lone gunman conclusion has been effectively proven wrong, but no other theory has been proven either. Carlos Marcello may have ordered the assassination, or he may not have. We will probably never know for sure. What we do know is that Marcello had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. We know that he made threats against the president. We know that Lee Harvey Oswald had connections to his organization through family members. We know that Jack Ruby had connections to the criminal underworld that Marcello controlled. We know that on the very day John F. E. Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, Carlos Marcello was found not guilty in a New Orleans courtroom. These facts do not prove anything for certain, but they raise questions that will not go away. Questions that trouble American history and challenge our understanding of how power really works in this country. Carlos Marcello took his secrets with him to the grave. The full truth of his crimes, including maybe the crime of the century, may never be known, but his story lives on. It is a dark chapter in American history that reminds us of the price we pay when we let power operate in the shadows. The humid Louisiana night settles over Metairie Cemetery, where Carlos Marcello lies under a simple headstone. The oak trees, covered with Spanish moss, cast long shadows in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz band is playing on Bourbon Street. The music drifts through the warm air, just as it has for generations. The tourists who come to New Orleans rarely think about the man who once ruled this city from a motel office on Airline Highway. They come for the food, the music, the atmosphere, not for the dark history that is hidden just beneath the surface. They walk on streets that Marcello once controlled. They eat in restaurants that he once owned. They gamble in casinos that his illegal operations helped make possible. But the old-timers remember, in the bars of Jefferson Parish, in the back rooms of Metairie, there are still men who speak of Carlos Marcello in low voices. They remember his power, his generosity to his friends, his complete lack of mercy for his enemies. They remember a time when one phone call from the Town and Country Motel could make or break a political career, could open or close a business, could spare or end a life. Those days are gone now. They have faded into history, just like the man himself. The New Orleans Mafia that Marcello built has shrunk until it is no longer important. The politicians he corrupted have died or retired. The witnesses who might have told his secrets have taken their knowledge with them to their own graves. But the questions remain. They hang over New Orleans like the humidity that never completely goes away, like the ghosts that people say still walk the old streets of the French Quarter. Did Carlos Marcello, the little man who built the biggest criminal empire in the American South, order the assassination of John F. Kennedy? We may never know. But as long as Americans care about justice, about truth, about understanding the forces that shaped their history, they will keep asking. And as long as they keep asking, the shadow of Carlos Marcello will continue to fall across the American landscape. And that is the story of Carlos Marcello, the little man who cast the longest shadow over American history. If this story kept you awake or helped you fall asleep, I would really like to hear about it. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought. And if you want more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button. We have plenty more tailies from the underworld coming your way. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Sleep well if you can.